Следващия лектор е Милинд Камколкър, който е директор на анализи от следващо поколение в Новартис САЩ. Той трябваше да бъде днес тук, но беше възпрепятстван и за това ще видите видео с неговата презентация. Мисля, че той ще каже също доста интересни неща, свързани с Big Data, къде е тази Big Data и някои неща ще се кажат и за изкуствения интелект, нещо, което също вече бележи голямо развитие в IT сферата.
My name is Mилинд Камколкър, and I'm the global head of data science at Novartis in a group called Digital Medicines, which is our innovation arm. My responsibility at Novartis is to look at new and innovative ways in which we can use information to better support our patients and to better support our customers, specifically the physician networks, in understanding new elements of disease pathways and new potential uses of data in the context of supporting their patient groups. I'm here today, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm here today to at least give you an insight into what we're seeing in the big data space, and specifically around how data is now hacking healthcare as we know it. I'll start out with, first of all, that healthcare is at an evolutionary inflection point. In the same way in which hominids became Homo sapiens during prehistoric times, there are numerous influences, numerous disruptions, much like the meteor was to the dinosaur age, that is influencing medicine today, and that is changing the landscape as we know it for something totally new. One could argue that medicine in itself is not a silo anymore. The hallmark of what is clinical practice is being changed in which the way in which clinical practice is being done, and the way in which the engagement and information is available to patients, payers, and of course pharmaceutical companies, and more importantly the physicians who are there to help treat our patients. And the techniques that are used today in this environment are changing massively. Artificial intelligence, 3D printing, new aspects of genomics. We're looking at computer science, crowdsourcing, geographical boundaries being broken down. Let's call it the citizen scientist and garage biotechs. All of these are almost sensory overload when we consider how much of that is breaking down the silo of medicine. And it's incredible. It really is incredible. The pace at which these exponential capabilities are impacting our industry is happening so fast that one can't help but be skeptical that is this real? Is this actually happening as we speak? The short answer to that is yes. And it's important that we take notice of that, because only when we're prepared can we start making the relevant plans to better support patients and the people that we are here today to address. So one of the big key moments in all of this is, of course, big data and the role that information has to play in the support of patients. And when we think about big data, the key thing we think about big data is, what is it exactly? What does it mean? Where is it being applied today? Be it in genomic sciences, be it in translational medicine, be it in customer engagement and online channel management, be it also in wearables and sensors now that are coming through. The sheer volume of data and the discrepancy in which this data floats around us today is incredible. And it's important that we now have unprecedented access to now not only access information, but access it within context of the patient that is required for it to be analyzed in. So when I first joined Novartis, one of the key questions that I got asked was, what is big data? What does it mean? And I felt, rather than going through a technical review of what big data is, we focus on something that everyone knows and something that crosses cultural boundaries. And I claim that big data is like Michael Jackson. In fact, Michael Jackson, being the person that he was, appropriately reflected the way in which big data can be characterized. And it's characterized predominantly in three areas: volume, so the sheer size of the data; velocity, in terms of the speed at which information is available to us; variety, in terms of what kinds of data are we dealing with: image data, unstructured information, social media data, electronic medical record data, clinical trial data, patient-reported data, and so forth. And, of course, complexity. In our environment, given that we do work under specific regulations and appropriate regulations, it's important to recognize that not all data is equal, and that all data necessarily needs to be treated as big data. Truth be told, it's just data. And the way in which we handle that data is what's critical. Our intended use of that information is most important within an ethical and appropriate way. But let's go back to what is big data. Let's start with Michael Jackson. Volume. Thriller was one of the #1 albums of all time, highest selling album of all time, with the most number of units sold. Variety. Michael Jackson's moves, I think we all know them. The moonwalk, the stepping on his toes, the the lean in from the famous video in Smooth Criminal. These are all elements that also quite well typify data that we see today in the big data context. Velocity. When Michael Jackson passed away, Twitter itself was broken given the speed at which information was being retweeted between his fans and people who wanted to know. In fact, it was argued that had it not been for Twitter, we only would have known about Michael Jackson's death, perhaps at the end of the day, not necessarily in real time. And last but not least, complexity. Michael Jackson had numerous relationships, many of which are highly questionable, one of which, of course, was his relationship with Mr. Bubbles, his monkey. I use that example not because it's meant to be taken lighthearted or anything like that, but the fact is, again, it's analogous to the way in which regulatory environments are often left subject to interpretation of how we use that data. And one of the most important things you can ask yourself when you consider the use of big data is, why are you using it, and is it an ethical use of that information? Now, of course, then I show you the technical view. And so when you talk to a technical guy like myself, who is well and truly entrenched in the data environment to the point of unhealthy obsession with data, it's a big world. The number of companies that are doing work in big data and data in general is enormous. Everything from data management to data storage to accessibility to the ways in which we mine it, all the way down to the ways in which we interpret and visualize that information. It is a big, big field, and a field which I personally am very proud to be a part of. And I would encourage you as physicians, many of the physicians that I meet both in the United States as well as other parts of the world, are now becoming more and more citizen data scientists themselves. Many of my good friends who work over at Stanford and over in the UK, for example, have now learned machine learning for their own benefit to understand simply, can I better transpose radiology exams and histology exams and pathology exams through image analysis to better predict the way in which my patients are actually behaving or how their pathogenesis on treatment pathways are going. So what are we doing at Novartis? Well, for us, it comes down to basics. It's the right drug for the right patient at the right time. Simple. Simple statement, but often incredibly complex to dissect from a data and treatment pathway paradigm. In fact, one could argue the patient journey in itself really forms the basis in which we use this information, from disease awareness to onboarding and diagnosis to treatment and adherence. In every single one of those steps, there is a phenomenal amount of data that's being generated. And the way in which we help capture and analyze that information is critical for us to provide a more positive experience to our patient populations, but also a very positive experience to the people that support those patient populations, including the physicians and the scientists. When we think about big data use cases throughout the patient journey, it could be things like screening, diagnostic processes, identifying patients with rare disease. It could be things like treatment choices, pre-treatment testing, first dose, onboarding. To this day, one of the most critical areas that is still yet largely unaddressed is the area of onboarding onto a new treatment pathway. And we still see this particularly from a social media perspective when we analyze in chronic care. Most patients simply don't know what to do when they've been told what they have to do, particularly when they have a new kind of disease. And what we often find is patients are often expressing rather confusing sentiment, apprehensive sentiment that, look, I've been diagnosed with this. What does this mean for my current wellness and lifestyle? Whether it's an eye or ophthalmic disease area where patients may have driven before and now are questioning their ability to drive, so what are the alternatives available for them? To things like COPD, where whilst it's a chronic area, many patients are still yet unfamiliar of how best to actually now conduct their lifestyle, because this is something that they've now grown to live with, but are really not sure how the treatment's going to help them, and more importantly, help them in their current day-to-day activities. These are all opportunities, guys, for us. These are immense opportunities for us, because never before have we been able to quantify the kind of information that's coming through and quantify what is the meaning of the context by which a patient is speaking in or a physician is speaking in to how we support them appropriately. That quantification allows not only for new business opportunities, but new ethical and emotional opportunities to really empathize with our end users at the end of the day. And this is, for me, a very personal journey when it comes to big data. I know from my own circumstances with both my family and my loved ones, when we think about heart failure, when we think about COPD, when I think about also speech and mental issues, these are all the kinds of things where I feel that data and the understanding of that data in context really helps not only my family, but explain also why certain things are happening. I want to finish here with suggesting that what's really fascinating to me in this whole space, particularly in the kinds of work that we're doing at Novartis, and what we're really excited about in our partnerships with new technology companies as well as physician networks as well, are areas such as deep learning. You've probably heard the buzzwords around Google's deep learning and IBM Watson as being two major companies that are doing very exciting work in the space. But deep learning effectively is the ability to look at something in context, analyze it from a digital perspective, and put it to a meaning that we never had before. And it almost requires you as a stakeholder to unlearn everything that you've learned so you can re-look at that particular contextual situation with a new pair of lens. Let's call it maybe an enlightened pair of lens. We talk about natural language processing. Now, as you can tell on this particular slide, I am a big Star Wars fan, and so I've decided to choose images here that are related to that. So Chewbacca, whilst he only growled, it was very clear through his growls and the emotion by which he growled what he was trying to say. And we have to keep in mind that the patient dialect and the physician dialect are two very different dialects. Clinical outcomes described in a patient setting might be very different when translated or processed through natural language to what a physician may describe. And I'd argue one of the key things we need to start doing is really understanding what is the context by which a patient talks about pain, or which a patient talks about how they're feeling, and understanding that natural language, if you will, or processing that natural language will enable us to have a greater level of empathy with our patients. Behavior and environment. Now, this is one of the things that's that I'm personally very passionate about. I don't think that we're close to yet really doing big data if we don't look at the context by which we work with patients. Number one, what behaviors, what triggers are causing certain behavior types in patients? Do patients have specific behavioral types in themselves? Who is more quiet? Who is more outspoken? Who is more interesting, or who is interesting but subdued? Many of these kinds of things are really important for us to understand. I would argue weather perhaps is the biggest contributor to a patient's health, whether it's pollution, whether it's pollen counts, whether it's simply a gray or rainy day that's outside. All of these things, again, give us contextual evidence of a specific clinical outcome that may be happening with our patient populations. And again, if you truly were to harness the power of big data, we really need to take into those two things in consideration. Geographies as well, cultural biases, all of these things are so critical. I look at it as a very exciting time to be in this space, to really start harnessing that power of data. Last but not least, I'm very passionate about the use of networks. As a geneticist and systems biology person by training, one of the things that I tend to apply to my thinking in the world is that we live very much in a connected world, whether it's our online attributes or whether it's simply our personal relationships with people we know. If we really were to think about how the context by which people work, live, and behave in, you can often describe that as a network or as a pathway of discrete relationships, starting at a molecular level and abstracting itself to a human dynamic or interpersonal anthropological level. Again, these are important attributes which we can now start mapping through the use of an appropriate and ethical use of data. So I thank you all. I hope I haven't bored you, and I hope I haven't given you things to question, oh my God, there's so much to do, is this even really appropriate? My humble feedback to you is embrace the information age, embrace the data age, but embrace it with a sensibility that treats our patients first and foremost with the most ethical and responsible way of how they would like to be treated. That said, I thank you. And I wish I could have been there in person to see the lovely city, Sophia.